Start
Empezar ya
streaming.
se está yendo el tiempo. Start streaming.
Start streaming. Vale, hemos empezado, chicos, el directo. En
Vale, me
teoría,
lo puedo poner por aquí.
no sé si estará notificando ya o no habrá notificado. Pero, chicos, en 3 minutos tenemos el anuncio oficial de PlayStation 5. Vamos.
¿Qué tal, chavales? ¿Cómo
Para...
estáis? Canal de Glow. Podéis buscar Glow y
Mami, a todo el
un poco
spam,
de
de
spam.
verdad.
Nada más. Por la cara. Vamos a buscar por aquí. Ay, no, no le play. No le play. No, no estás en directo, ¿eh?
Sí, ahora estará notificando. Hace
Ah,
4
sí,
segundos,
anuncio
ahora
oficial de
sí.
la Play 5. Ah,
Venga, va, perfecto.
vale, vale, sí, mira.
Se escucha bien, ¿no? Espérate, voy a hacer un copia y pega del directo y lo voy a compartir. Bueno, para lo que no sepáis, este es Mark, ¿vale? Es amigo mío y aficionado de estas noticias de Play. Él, de hecho, fue quien me lo comentó y gracias a él estamos haciendo este directo.
Ah, vale, sí, es verdad.
Así que, muchas gracias, Mark.
De nada, de nada.
Vamos a ver el
Ya,
directito.
y 58.
Y 58, madre mía, ¿eh? Ojo que se nos acerca el momento, Mark. Ahora para que digan, por el coronavirus le hemos cancelado el proyecto, ¿te imaginas?
¿Te imaginas?
Buah, de verdad, loco.
Yo cojo y me suicido. No, tampoco tanto. Ah, ni de salida, porque las consolas mejor dejarlas que pase un poco el tiempo al principio, ¿sabes?
Sí, sí, sí. Yo de
Pero
hecho
al principio no es
la
lo
Play,
mejor.
la PlayStation 4, de hecho yo me la compré muy tarde, muy tarde.
Y yo más que tú.
Y bueno, no sé si tú te la compraste
Exactamente.
antes o después, pero más o
No,
menos
no,
nos la
después,
compramos el
después.
mismo verano, me acuerdo.
No,
¿No?
no sé yo. No, yo en junio. Junio, julio. Te
Ah,
la
bueno,
compraste un año antes,
yo
¿no?
acabé,
Unos
no, yo
meses
acabé
antes.
cuando, no, yo me la compré cuando me dieron las notas
Sí, sí,
finales de
¿dónde está?
cuarto,
Por
de cuarto.
la página por si acaso. Dentro de poco, dice.
Empezará dentro de poco, o sea, queda menos de un minuto, chicos.
Chavales.
Vamos.
Tenemos. Voy a ver los espectadores que estoy aquí controlando. Soy tú,
Ahí
Mar.
lo tenemos, de hecho, en la pantalla vamos
Un
a poner
espectador,
ya.
¿quién es?
Vamos a poner ya la pantalla, pues yo. Vale, tenemos ya el directito por aquí. Si me esperáis,
Por cierto, espera. Chavales,
pues...
comentadnos por en los comentarios cómo lleváis la cuarentena, cómo va el coronavirus. ¿Estáis bien, mal? ¿No os ha tenido que ir? Yo me quedo
Joder, he
después.
tenido que ir corriendo a por agua por miedo a perderme algo, loco.
A ver si empieza ya.
El viaje empieza ya. Volaré, na, na, Little
Venga.
Einstein.
Tío, era a
Sin
las 5.
temor, el mundo
Cabrones.
alrededor. Na, 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 na. Venga, va.
Si soy un espectador. Ah, pero soy yo, claro.
Ay, qué idiota.
Hostia. Claro, desde luego había pedido un espectador.
Venga,
Soy yo.
ya, chicos, que esto empieza. Si me miráis mirando para allá... ¡Eh! Ha empezado.
Me está cargando.
En un minuto.
Vale, vale, vale. 2 minutos.
En un
Pues voy a bajar
minutito.
2 minutos.
Bueno, 2 minutos.
No, en 2.
Dos.
Eso. Vale, hay otro espectador que no sé.
Vale, vamos a ponerlo así. Chicos, esto empieza. Això comença. Venga, vamos allá. ¿Cuánta gente habrá en directo retransmitiendo lo mismo? Es mi pregunta.
Retraso de la hostia, en el directo.
¿Eh?
Si es un retraso de la hostia en el directo.
Ya. No sé por qué,
He
pero
escuchado
bueno.
una palabra mía de hace 30
Ya, porque lo tengo con 30 segundos de retraso o algo así.
minutos.
Pues
Para que no
mira,
te hagan
porque...
Steam Sniping.
¿Eh?
Para que no te hagan Steam Sniping.
¿Qué es eso?
¿No sabes qué es?
No.
Cuando YouTube está jugando a Fortnite y tiene una calidad de directo muy buena, la gente consigue meterse en su partida y joder. Se llama
Ah.
el
No,
Steam
simplemente lo
Sniping, se
tengo
llama.
para poder ver lo que ya he hecho antes.
Ah,
Para ver si
claro,
todo funciona bien y tal.
claro, bien pensado.
Lo malo son los comentarios de la gente que irán más tarde, pero bueno. Bueno, chicos, 30 segundos que quedan para empezar Una nueva fase en las consolas. Una nueva época, una nueva era de las
La
videoconsolas.
nueva generación de las consolas, chavales.
Esta es la
Y-
New Gen, ¿eh? Esta es la New
Sí,
Gen.
esta sí que era muy bien.
Esto es
Solo estoy
la
yo
New.
de espectador.
Ya,
Ponlo
ya
en
lo
Insta
sé.
o algo porque.
Ya lo he puesto.
Uah,
Ya.
12, 13, 12, 11,
10, venga, va.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4,
4,
3,
3,
2,
2, 1,
1. ¡Pum!
empezamos. A ver, ahora silencio, por favor.
Sí,
Te
me
voy a
caí.
poner un poco más alto.
To cancel the talk that we had planned for GDC. But we do have some super exciting news about PS5, and who better to bring that to you than the one and only Mark Cerny. Without further ado, over to you, Mark.
Thank you, Jim.
¿Tú crees que revelarán el diseño de la Play 5?
There will be
No
lots
sé,
of
tío.
chances later on this year to look at the PlayStation 5 games. Today, I want to talk a bit about our goals for the PlayStation 5 hardware and how they influenced the development of the console. I think you all know I'm a big
Vale,
believer in
el
console
hardware.
generations. Once
Espérate,
every
subtítulos.
5 or 6 or 7 years, a console arrives with
Vale.
substantially new
Las primeras
capabilities.
plays.
There's a lot of learning by the game developers, hopefully not too overwhelming, and soon
Mira, la
those
3 que
games
sale ahí es la
never have been
versión de la
created
mía.
before.
La
Sí,
gorda.
la
gorda.
gorda.
Now, it used to be that as a console
Hay como
designer,
20.000
you'd
versiones.
somehow intuit what would be the best set of capabilities for the new console, and then build it in complete secrecy. For the PlayStation consoles, that period lasted through PlayStation 3, a powerful and groundbreaking console, but also one that caused quite a lot of heartache, as it was initially difficult to develop games for. So, starting with PlayStation 4, we've taken a different approach, roughly centered around 3 principles. The first of these is listening to the developers, which is to say that a lot of what we put into a console derives directly from the needs and aspirations of the game creators. We definitely do have some ideas of our own, but at the core of our philosophy for designing consoles is that game players are here for the fantastic games, which is to say that game creators matter. Anything we can do to make life easier for the game creators or help them
Exacto.
realize their dreams, we will do. So, about once every 2 years, I take a tour of the industry. I go to the various developers and publishers, sit down, and discuss how they're doing with the current consoles and what they'd like to see in future consoles. This requires weeks on the road, as reaching the bulk of the game creators involves talking to well over 100 people at something like 24 publishers and developers. And it is incredibly valuable. By the way, the feature most requested by the developers, that was an SSD, which we were very happy
SSD,
to put in
van a
the
meter un
hardware,
SSD.
but a lot of problem solving was required. I'll be doing a deep dive on the SSD and surrounding systems later on in this talk. It's also key to make a generational leap while keeping the console sufficiently familiar to game developers. I think about this in terms of balancing evolution and revolution. Now, with PlayStation 1, 2, and 3, the target was a revolution each time with a brand new feature set. That was great in many ways, but time for the developers to get up and running got longer with each console. In the past, I've called this time to triangle. Here's what I had for those 3 consoles. To be clear, I'm not talking about time to make a game. Developers will be ambitious, and it may take them 6 years or so to realize their vision. What I'm talking about is that
Están hablando ahora del
time
tiempo de
before
diseño de
graphics
las
and other
consolas,
aspects
supongo.
of game
Sí.
development are up and running,
A ver.
and trying to minimize that. On the other hand, if we're trying to reduce that dead time to 0, that means the hardware architecture can't change at all. We're handcuffed. We need to judge for each feature what value it adds and whether it's worth the increase in developer time needed to support it. So with PlayStation 4, we were able to strike a pretty good balance between performance and familiarity. We got required learning back to PlayStation 1 levels. With PS5, the GPU was definitely the area we felt the most tension between adding new features and keeping a familiar programming model. Ultimately, I think we've ended up with something
Uy, no han puesto el
under a
diseño,
month
eh.
of getting up to speed.
Ya,
No
ya.
han puesto el
That's because
diseño.
we're striking about the right balance. I'll go into a bit more detail later today about our philosophy with the GPU and the specific feature set that resulted from it. It's also very important for us, as the hardware team, to find new dreams, by which I mean something other than CPU performance, GPU performance, and the amount of RAM. The increase in graphics performance over the past 2 decades has been astonishing, but there are other areas in which we can innovate and provide significant value to the game creators, and through them, the players. That's why the SSD was very much on our list of directions to explore, regardless of what came out of the conversations with game developers and publishers. The biggest feature in this category is the custom engine for audio. That's today's final topic. The push for vastly improved audio, and in particular 3D audio, isn't something that came out of the developer. It's much more the case that we had a dream.
Supongo que será para la inmersión dentro del juego.
5 years from now, and then worked out a number of steps to set us.
Sí, no de la Play 5, ¿no? Pero lo van a
here
meter.
Again are the 3 principles. The first being enabling the desires of developers to drive the hardware design. To me, the SSD really is the key to the next generation. It's a game changer. And it was the number one
SSD para que vaya más rápido el juego.
for PlayStation 5. As in, we know it's probably impossible, but can you put an SSD in it? That was a discussion we were also having internally. It was clear that the presence of a hard drive in every PlayStation 4 was having a positive impact. A lot of things that would simply have been impossible at Blu-ray disc speeds were now possible. At the same time, though, in 2015 and 2016, when we were having these conversations, developers were already banging up against the limits of the hard drive. And a lot of developer time was being spent designing around slow load speeds. I want to focus in on just one number here, which is how long it takes to load a gigabyte of data from a hard drive.
Ojo, están hablando de la velocidad de procesamiento,
That hard drives are neither particularly fast.
Pero de la Play 4, exactamente.
All your data is in one block,
Una Play 4 con HDD,
likely,
o sea, un disco duro mecánico.
50 to 100 megabytes a second, depending on where the data is located. Let's assume it's on the outer edge, which means loading a gigabyte takes 10 seconds. If you compress your game packages, you can fit more data on the Blu-ray disc and also effectively boost your hard drive read speed by the compression ratio. We support zlib decompression on PlayStation 4 that gets you something like 50% more data on the disc and 50% higher effective read speed. Unfortunately, though, it's highly likely that your data is scattered around in various files on the hard drive, as well as sourced from multiple locations within those files. So lots of seeks are needed at 2 to 50-ish milliseconds each. My rule of thumb is that the hard drive is spending 2/3 of its time seeking, and only 1/3 of its time actually loading data. Putting all of that together, a gigabyte is very roughly 20 seconds to load from a hard drive. Now, a gigabyte is not much data. Games are using 5 or 6 gigabytes of RAM on PlayStation 4, so boot times and load times can get pretty grim. Or to put that differently, as a player, you wait for the game to boot, wait for the game to load, wait for the level to reload every time you die, and you wait for what is euphemistically called fast travel. And all of that leads to the dream. What if we could have not just an SSD, but a blindingly fast
Ojo,
SSD?
5 gigas por segundo.
Gigabytes a second from
¿Qué
it. What would
dices?
change?
5 segundos por lo menos, por lo menos, a eso tirando por lo bajo.
Seeks as such.
El ancho de banda de 5 gigas, madre mía.
You can read data from 1,000 different
A
locations.
ver,
Pretty much.
la memoria de la PlayStation 5 con la de la PlayStation 4. Claro, la PlayStation 4 tiene un HDD, un disco duro mecánico. La Play 5 le van a meter un SSD. Por eso es más cara, porque los discos...
instantáneo que no sé qué es.
El Seek Time, que no sé qué será.
That's amazing. We're talking
Pero,
two orders of magnitude.
Sí. Un segundo, o sea, un giga, un 20 segundos. 2 gigas en 0,27 segundos.
A second for the SSD, the potential is
¿Eso va flying, instalar los juegos?
There are no load screens. The game just fades down while loading a half dozen
Mira,
gigabytes.
no
It
load
fades
screens ha
down.
dicho.
Sí, ha dicho que no habrá pantallas de carga.
Immediately back in the
¿Está el
action when
Fortnite?
you're
¿Están
done.
los juegos digitales
And
gratis?
fast travel becomes
¿El
so
Warzone y
fast
todo
that
eso estará?
blink and you
Mi
miss it.
pregunta.
As game creators, we
No lo
go
sé.
from trying to distract the player from how long fast travel is taking, like those Spider-Man subway rides, to being
Ojo, ha dicho
so
algo de Spider-Man.
blindingly fast that we might even have to slow that transition down. Pretty cool, right? But for me, this is not the primary reason to change from a hard drive to an SSD. The primary reason for an ultra-fast SSD is that it gives the game designer freedom. Or to put that
es más
differently,
pequeño.
with a hard drive, the 20 seconds that it takes to load a gigabyte can sabotage the game that the developer is trying to create. I think Almost all of us in the room have experienced this, maybe in different ways. Say we're making an adventure game and we have two rich environments where we each want enough textures and models to fill
Hablando de
them,
las texturas.
which you can
Sí.
do as long as you have a long staircase or elevator ride or a windy corridor where you can ditch the old assets and then take 30 seconds or so to load the new assets. Having a 30-second elevator ride is a little extreme. More realistically, we'd probably chop the world into a number of smaller pieces and then do some calculations with sight lines and run speeds like we did for Haven City when we were making Jack 2. The game is 20 years old, but not much has changed since then. All those twisty passages are there for a reason. There's a whole subset of level design dedicated to this sort of work, but still, it's a giant distraction for a team that just wants to make their game. So when I talked about the dream of an SSD, part of the reason for that 5
Streaming,
gigabyte per
ojo,
second target was to
habla de los
eliminate
directos.
Ojo,
noise.
sí, sí, sí.
But also part of the reason for that target was streaming.
Directos
As
de
in,
Play 4.
what if the
Los
SSD is so fast that as the player is turning around, it's possible to load textures for everything behind the player in that split second? If you figure that it takes half a second to turn, that's 4 gigabytes of compressed data you can load. That sounds about right for next gen. Anyway, back to the hard drive.
Joder.
Another strategy for increasing effective read speed is to make big sequential chunks of data. For example, we might group all the data together for each city block. That removes most of the seeks, and the streaming gets faster. But there's a downside too, which is that frequently used data is included in many chunks and therefore is on the hard drive many, many times. Marvel's Spider-Man uses this strategy, and though it works very well for increasing the streaming speed,
Me han dicho que
there's
te
a
salude,
massive
pues...
duplication as a
Hola,
result.
Alan
Some
Santos.
of the objects like mailboxes or news racks are on the hard drive 400 times. What I'm describing here are things that cramp a creative director's style.
Si no lo he
Either
visto antes
level
es que estaba
design gets
mirando
a
la
little bit
pantalla.
boring in places, or the data is duplicated so many times that it no longer fits on the Blu-ray disc. And you end up with hard limits on the player's run speed or driving speed. The player can't go faster than the load speed from the hard drive. And finally, I'm sure many of you have noticed that after a patch download, the PlayStation 4 will sometimes take a long time to install the patch. That's because when just part of a file has been changed, the new data can be downloaded pretty quickly. But before the game boots up, a brand new file has to be constructed that includes the changed portion. Otherwise, every change would add a seek or two. Even so, you can occasionally see this happening on game titles. They start to hitch once they get patched enough.
La Play 5
With an
harán todo en
SSD,
uno, ¿no?
though, no seeks. So no
Supongo.
need to make brand new files with the changes incorporated into them, which means no installs as you know them today.
O sea que en la Play 5 acaban de
There's
decir
yet
que no va a haber
one more
instalaciones
benefit,
o
which is
algo
that
así
system
parecido.
memory
Bueno,
can
como
be used
conocemos a
much
día de
more
hoy, ha dicho,
efficiently.
bro.
Sí.
On
Luego,
PlayStation
¿verdad?
4, game data on the hard drive feels very distant and
Puro
difficult to
engine
use.
paradigma.
By the time you realize you need a piece of data,
O
it's
sea, esto es lo de
much
ahora
too
de la
late
Play
to go out
4.
and load it. So system
Sí.
memory has to contain all of the data that could be used in the next 30 seconds or
segundos,
so
sí.
of gameplay. That means a lot of the 8 gigabytes of system memory is idle. It's just waiting there to be potentially used. On PlayStation 5, though, the SSD is very close to being like more
Madre
RAM.
mía, 16
Typically,
GB de
it's
RAM la
fast enough
PlayStation
that when you
5.
realize you need a piece
Ojo.
of data, you can just
No.
load it from the SSD.
El
and
doble
use
que
it.
la Play 4. Y
There's
si
no
la Play
need
4
to
ya
have
va
lots of
flying,
data
imagínate la
blocked in
6.
system memory
O sea,
waiting to
la 5,
potentially
perdón.
be used.
Ya, la sé.
Different
O no me
ways
he
to
llegado.
look at it
Todavía
is
no hemos
that
sacado la
most
5 y ya
of the
estamos con la
RAM
6.
is working on the game's behalf. This is one of the reasons that 16 gigabytes of GDDR6 feels right for PlayStation 5. The
Y en vez
presence of
de
the
es
SSD
GDDR.
reduces the need for a massive
Sí, en vez de la
intergenerational
GDDR5
increase
es la
in size.
6, más moderna, con lo
So,
cual
back to
mejores
the dream of the
características.
SSD. Here's the set of targets. Boot the
A
game
ver.
in a second. No load
Yo
screens.
deseo en el puto diseño ya.
Design
tío.
freedom, meaning no twisty passages
Bueno,
or
sí.
long
Ultra
corridors.
High Speed Streaming, eso me
More
vendría
game
bien a
on the
mí.
disk and more game on the SSD.
De
And
duplicate
finally,
tiene
those patch installs go away. The reality, though, is that the
todo lo que
SSD
promete
is
en
just
verdad.
one
Ojo,
piece of the puzzle. There's a lot of places where bottlenecks can occur in between the SSD and the game code that uses the data. You can see this on PlayStation 4. If I use an SSD with
¿eso
10
significa que van a sacar
times
algo
the
de
speed of
jugar?
a standard hard drive, I probably
Significa que están
see only
comparando lo de
double
ahora
the
con lo
loading
de
speed,
antes.
if that.
No, porque eso es Play
For
5 o Play
PlayStation
4, porque
5,
pones
our goal
SSD.
was not
Eso es
just
que va a
that
salir
the
el God of
SSD
War, yo
itself
creo.
would be 100 times
Es
Pero
faster.
verdad,
lo
puede
harán
que nos
compatible.
estén dando, puede que nos
Loads
estén
and
dando una
streaming
pista,
would
¿eh?
be 100 times
O a lo mejor es que
faster.
solo
Pues
han
creo que
cogido un
dijeron,
fotograma de un
Single
juego y ya está.
potential
no
bottleneck
sé si es
needed to be
verdad, pero creo que
addressed.
dijeron que
And there
serían
are a
compatibles
lot of them.
a 5.
Sí,
Let's
eso es
look at
verdad, lo
check-in
dijeron.
and what happens when it's
Ahora, a lo
Ah,
mejor
overhead
lo
pues
dicen
ya
ahora.
God of War
A lo
entonces.
mejor lo dicen ahora.
Conceptually, check-in is a pretty
¿Verdad?
simple
Se filtró
process.
un
Data
gameplay
is
de
loaded into
Spider-Man
system memory
de
from
Play
a
4
hard
en la Play
drive or
5.
SSD.
Es
It's
verdad.
examined,
Con lo de
a
los
few
tests estos
values
que
are
hicieron.
tweaked to check it in, and then it's moved to its final
Eso
location. At the SSD
vamos a
speeds we're
escuchar.
talking about, that last part, moving the data, meaning copying it from one location to another, takes roughly an entire next-gen CPU core. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. If all the overheads get 100 times larger, that will cripple the frame rate as soon as the player moves, and that massive stream of data
O
starts.
sea que habrá más FPS, obviamente. A lo mejor el GTA, en vez de ir a 60, a lo mejor va a 144 FPS.
Custom flash
Qué
controller
bien.
and a number of custom units
Custom
in
flash
our main
controller.
chip. The flash controller in the SSD was designed for smooth and bottleneck-free operation, but also with games in mind. For example, there are 6 levels of priority when reading from the SSD. Priority is very important.
¿Cuánto dinero tiene que
Imagine
tener ese
the
tío,
player
Noel?
heading into some
Pues
new
ya ves.
location in the world and the game
Es el
requesting
creador,
a
¿no?
few
Es el
gigabytes
Mark
of
Cerny,
Ingeniero,
creo.
And
ingeniero
while
de
those
hardware.
textures are being
De,
loaded,
de, de, Play,
an
de
enemy is
PlayStation.
shot and
Ya
has to
ves.
speak
Ahora,
a few
loco.
dying words. Having
Bueno,
multiple
si nosotros
priorities
acabamos los
lets the
estudios, puede
file
que
Se
acabemos
puede
ahí.
retirar.
words get loaded immediately. On one side, that flash controller connects to the actual flash dies
12
that supply
channel
the storage.
interface.
To reach our bandwidth target of 5 gigabytes a second, we ended up with a 12-channel interface. 8 channels wouldn't be enough.
O sea, 11.
The resulting
O sea, 12.
bandwidth we've achieved is actually 5.5 gigabytes a second. With a 12-channel interface, the most natural size that emerges for an SSD is 825 gigabytes. The key question for us was, is that enough? I mean, it's tempting to add more, but flash certainly doesn't come cheap.
Ojo, están hablando de la memoria de capacidad de la Play 4, y 5.
Ultimately, we resolved this question by looking at the play patterns of a broad range of gamers. We examined the specific games that they were playing over the course of a weekend or a week or a month, and whether that set of games would fit properly on the SSD. We were able to establish that the friction caused by reinstalls or redownloads would be quite low, and so we locked in on that 825 gigabyte size, while also preparing multiple strategies so that those who want more storage can add it. I'll go through the details in a moment.
Ojo, acaban de decir que se podrá ampliar la memoria,
On the other side, it connects to our main custom chip via 4 lanes of Gen 4 PCIe. And inside the main custom chip is a
O sea, cuando dices que es una Play de 1 tera, es mentira. O sea, dice que es de una memoria de 825 gigas.
PlayStation 4 used ZLib as
Sí,
its
eso es
compression
verdad.
format.
Y ahora dicen que aunque la Play 5 va a seguir teniendo esa cantidad de memoria, pero va a poderse ampliar.
Kraken
Okay.
from Rad Game Tools. It's like ZLib's smarter cousin. Simple, similar types of algorithms, but about 10% better compression, which is pretty big. That means 10% more game on the UHD Blu-ray disc or on the SSD. Kraken had only been out for a year, but it was already becoming a de facto industry standard. Half of the teams I talked to were either using it or getting ready to evaluate it. So we hustled and built a custom decompressor into the I/O unit, one capable of handling over 5 gigabytes of Kraken format input data a second. After decompression, that typically becomes 8 or 9 gigabytes, but the unit itself is capable of outputting as much as 22 gigabytes a second if the data happen to compress particularly well. By the way, in terms of performance, that custom decompressor equates to 9 of our Zen 2 cores. That's what it would take to decompress the Kraken stream with a conventional CPU. There's a lot more in the custom I/O unit, including a dedicated DMA controller. The game can direct exactly where it wants to send the
Ahora mismo
data
están hablando
to
de la
the
placa
SSD.
base de la
This
Play
equates to
5,
another
supongo.
Zen
Sí.
2 core or 2 in terms of its copy performance.
Verdad.
Its primary purpose is to remove check-in as a bottleneck. There's 2
Que digo yo, si ahora están
dedicated
hablando de los
I/O processors and a
internos,
larger
después de
RAM
esto
pool.
vendrán
These aren't
los
Zen 2
externos,
cores,
es
they're
decir,
the
el diseño
direct
oficial de la
variety
Play
of hardware
5.
around them.
Eso
One
es
of the
verdad.
coprocessors is dedicated to SSD I/O. This lets us bypass traditional file I/O and its bottlenecks when reading
Tú,
from the
in,
SSD.
out.
The other is responsible for memory mapping, which I know doesn't sound like anything related to the SSD, but a lot of developers map and remap memory as part of file I/O, and this too can become a bottleneck. There are coherency engines to assist the coprocessors. Coherency comes up a lot in places. Probably the biggest coherency issue is stale data in the GPU caches. Flushing all of the GPU caches whenever the SSD is read is an unattractive option. It could really hurt the GPU performance. So we've implemented a gentler way of doing things, where the coherency engines inform the GPU of the overwritten address ranges, and custom scrubbers in several dozen GPU caches do pinpoint evictions of just those address ranges. The best thing is, as a game developer, when you read from the SSD, you don't need to know any of this. You don't even need to know that your data is compressed. You just indicate what data you'd like to read from your original uncompressed file and where you'd like to put it, and the whole process of loading it happens invisibly to you and at very high speed. Back to the dream. Thanks to all of that surrounding hardware, our 5.5 gigabytes a second really should translate into something like 100 times faster I/O than PS4 and allow the dream of no load speeds and super fast streaming to become a reality. Having said that, expandability of our SSD is going to be quite
Bueno, a ver, piensa que un SSD sí que es mejor que...
storage to whatever we put in the console. Now, the kind of storage you need depends on how you're going to use it. If you have an extensive PlayStation 4 library and you'd like to take advantage of backwards compatibility to play those games on PlayStation 5, then a large external hard drive is ideal. You can leave your games on the hard drive and play them directly from there, thus saving the pricier SSD storage for your PlayStation 5 titles, or you can copy your active PlayStation 4 titles to the SSD.
Ojo, acaban de decir que puedes copiar los juegos de Play 4 en un disco duro externo. Eso significa que los juegos de Play 4 serán compatibles con los juegos de Play 5. O sea, con la Play 5. Lo acaban de confirmar, ¿eh? Se la ha escapado.
They connect through the custom I/O unit just like our SSD does. So they can take full advantage of the decompression, I/O coprocessors, and all the other features I was talking about. Here's the catch, though. That commercial drive has to be at least as fast as ours. Games that rely on the speed of our SSD need to work flawlessly with any M2 drive. When I gave the Wired interview last year, I said that the PlayStation 5 SSD was faster than anything available on PC. At the time, commercial M2 drives used PCIe 3.0, and 4 lanes of that cap out at 3.5 gigabytes
PCI Express es
In other
la
words,
tarjeta
no
gráfica.
PCIe 3.0 drive can hit the required spec. M2 drives with PCIe 4.0 are
Madre
now
mía.
out on the market. We're getting our samples and seeing
7 GB de
4 or 5
procesamiento gráfico
gigabytes
por
a second.
segundo, supongo.
By year's end, I expect there will be drives that saturate 4.0 and support 7 gigabytes a second. Having said that, we are comparing apples and oranges, though, because that commercial M2 drive will have its own architecture, its own flash controller, and so on. For example, the NVMe specification lays out a priority scheme for requests that the M2 drives can use. And that scheme is pretty nice, but it only has 2 true priority levels. Our drive supports 6. We can hook up a drive with only 2 priority levels, definitely, but our custom I/O unit has to arbitrate the extra priorities rather than the M2 drive's flash controller, and so the M2 drive needs a little extra speed to take care of issues arising from the different approach. That commercial drive also needs to physically fit inside of the bay we created in PlayStation 5 for M2 drives. Unlike internal hard drives, there's unfortunately no standard for the height of an M2 drive. And some M2 drives have giant heat sinks. In fact, some of them even have their own fans. Right now, we're getting M2 drive samples and benchmarking them in various ways. When games hit beta as they get ready for the PlayStation 5 launch at year-end, we'll also be doing some compatibility testing to make sure that the architecture of particular M2 drives isn't too foreign for the games to handle. Once we've done that compatibility testing, we should be able to start letting you know which drives will physically fit and which drive samples have benchmarked
Vale,
appropriately.
están hablando ahora de la compatibilidad, exactamente, compatibilidad de discos externos, supongo.
A bit past it, so please hold off on getting that M2 drive until you hear from us. Okay, back to our
Para el
principles.
juego fluyan.
Balancing evolution and revolution is the second of them. This was
Ojo.
definitely a recurring theme with the GPU.
Vale.
We need new GPU features and capabilities. If we only have more performance, it's not really a new generation of console. Of course, many of these capabilities result in more performance. That's part of why a PlayStation 5 teraflop is more powerful than a PlayStation 4 teraflop. But we aren't just looking for the performance. We also need the ability to do something with the GPU that could not have been done before. And we need higher performance per watt. Every time we double the performance of some GPU component, we don't want to find out we've doubled the power consumed and the heat produced. But at the same time, we have to make sure the GPU can run PS4 games, and we have to ensure
acaba de
that the
decir,
architecture is easy
Sí.
for
Lo
acaba de
developers
decir.
to adopt. Now, backwards
Backwards
compatibility was handled
compatibility,
masterfully by
familiar y
AMD.
no sé
They
qué.
treated it as a key need
De
throughout
hecho, nos
design.
tenemos que asegurar de que los juegos
As
de
our
PS4
solution to
sean
adding new
compatibles con la
features without
5.
blindsiding developers,
Sí, lo he
we
escuchado.
made
Lo he
sure that
escuchado.
if there were new significant
Y
features,
más y
it
tendrán
would be
más rendimiento
optional
de
to use them. The
Exactamente.
GPU supports ray tracing, but you don't have to use ray tracing to make your game.
el ray
The
tracing,
GPU
que es un
supports
Ya ha
efecto
dicho
de-
que tiene
so you can
el
release your first
RTX,
game on PlayStation 5 without making
trazado de
any use of
rayos.
them. Before I get into the capabilities of the GPU, I'd like to make clear 2 points that can be quite confusing. First, we have a custom AMD GPU based on their RDNA 2 technology. What does that mean?
Vale.
GPU,
AMD is
eh,
continuously
Una AMD,
improving and
tiene
revising
una-
their tech. For
una-
O sea, tiene de la
Una
verga,
CPU,
¿no?
una
goals were
CPU
roughly
AMD
speaking, to
customizada.
reduce power consumption by re-architecting the GPU to put
Customizada
data
es por
close
ahí.
to where it's needed, to optimize the GPU for performance, and to add a new, more advanced feature set. But that feature set is malleable, which is to say that we have our own needs for PlayStation, and that can factor into what the AMD roadmap becomes. So collaboration is born. If we bring concepts to AMD that are felt to be widely useful, then they can be adopted into RDNA 2 and used broadly, including in PC GPUs. If the ideas are sufficiently specific to what we're trying to accomplish, like the GPU
Este parece que,
cache
que le
scores I was
pagan en vez de
talking
para hablar para
about, then they
sonreír.
end up being
Está todo el rato
just
sonriendo. Estará
If you
contento.
see a similar discrete GPU available as a PC card at roughly the same time as we release our console, that means our collaboration with AMD succeeded in producing technology useful in both worlds. It doesn't mean that we as Sony simply incorporated the PC part into our console. This continuous improvement in AMD technology means it's dangerous to rely on teraflops as an absolute indicator of performance, and CU count should be avoided as well. In the case of CPUs, we all understand this. The PlayStation 4 and PlayStation 5 each have 8 CPUs, but we never think that meant the capabilities and performance are equal. It's the same for CUs. For one thing, they've been getting much larger over time. Adding new features means adding lots of transistors. In fact, the transistor count for a PlayStation 5 CU is 62% larger than the transistor count for a PlayStation 4 CU. Second, the PlayStation 5 GPU is backwards compatible with PlayStation 4. What does that mean?
Vale,
One
compatibilidad.
way you can achieve backwards compatibility is to put the previous console's chipset in the new console, like we did with some PlayStation 3s. But that's, of course,
Había PlayStation 3 que tenían juegos de Play 2.
is to incorporate any differences
Hostia.
in the previous
Y me acabo de
console's
enterar
logic
ahora.
into the new console's
Ya, ya.
custom chips, meaning that even as the
puesto
technology
el-
evolves, the logic and feature set that PlayStation 4 and PlayStation
Native
4
mode,
Pro
progressive-
titles rely on
PS4
is still
progressive
available
mode.
in
Eso
backwards
significa que en la
compatibility
PlayStation
modes.
5
One
admitirá juegos de
advantage of
Play
this
4 Pro y
strategy is that
PS4
once
normal.
backwards
Sí,
compatibility
Y la
la
Slim
Slim
supongo
la
que
original.
también, es lo
in,
mismo.
it's not
Sí, sí,
as if a
por normal
customer will
selecciona la original y
remove
el
backwards
sí.
compatibility like it did on PlayStation 3. Achieving this unification
Native
of
mode,
functionality took years of efforts by AMD, as any roadmap advancement creates a potential divergence in logic. Running PS4 and PS4 titles at boosted frequencies has also added complexity. The boost is truly massive this time around, and some game code just can't handle it. Testing has to be done on a title-by-title basis. Results are excellent, though. We recently took a look at the top 100 PlayStation 4 titles as ranked by playtime, and we're expecting almost all of them to be playable at launch on PlayStation 5.
Acaba de decir que todos
With
los
regards to
juegos
new features,
serán
as I said,
compatibles en
our
el
strategy was
lanzamiento.
to try to break new ground,
No
but
sé,
at
no
the
me he
same
enterado bien.
time not to
Sí, sí,
require
yo creo que lo ha
use
dicho,
of the new GPU capabilities.
Yo me tienen ya
For
en
more
a
than
ver.
a decade, GPUs have
New
imposed
features.
a restriction
Nuevas
on game
cosas.
methods. Software handles vertex processing, but for the most part, dedicated hardware is responsible for the triangles and other geometry that the vertices form. That means it's not possible to do even basic optimizations, such as aborting processing of a vertex if all geometry that uses it is off-screen. PlayStation 5 has a new unit called the Geometry Engine, which brings handling of triangles and other primitives under full programmatic control. As a game developer, you're free to ignore its existence and use the PlayStation 5 GPU as if it were no more capable than the PS4 GPU, or you can use this new intelligence in various ways. Simple usage could be performance optimization, such as removing backfaced or off-screen vertices and triangles. More complex usage involves something called primitive shaders, which allow the game to synthesize geometry on the fly as it's being rendered. It's a brand new capability. Using primitive shaders on PlayStation 5 will allow for a broad variety of techniques, including smoothly varying level of detail, addition of procedural detail to close-up objects, and improvements to particle effects and other visual special effects. Another major new feature of our custom RDNA 2
Guau, qué bien se ve, loco.
GPU is ray tracing, using the same strategy as AMD's upcoming PC GPUs. The CUs
¿Te
contain
imaginas que
a
pues
new
dice
specialized
toda esta
unit called the
presentación ha sido
intersection
reproducida,
engine, which can calculate the intersection
qué?
of rays with
que la
boxes and
presentación de la tele está
to use
reproducida en
the
la Play
intersection
5,
engine, first you build
Sería
what is
guapo.
called an acceleration structure.
que tuviera
It's
para
data
reproducir
in
así
RAM
cosas.
that contains all of
Sí,
your
sí.
geometry. There's a specific set of formats you can use. They're variations on the same
VHH
concept.
instruction.
Then, in your shader program, you use a new instruction that asks the intersection engine to check a ray against the BVH. While the intersection engine is processing the requested ray triangle or ray box intersections, the shaders are free to do other work. Having said that, the ray tracing instruction is pretty memory intensive, so it's a good mix with logic-heavy code. There's of course no need to use ray tracing.
Uses of ray
PS4
tracing,
graphics engines
audio,
will run
global
just fine
illumination,
on
shaders.
PlayStation 5.
El ray
But
tracing
it presents
son
an
Los
opportunity
los
for those
reflejos,
interested. I'm
se
thinking
centra más en
it'll take
iluminación
less than a
y
million rays
reflejos.
a second to have a big
Iluminación,
impact on
vamos.
audio. That should be enough for audio occlusion and some reverb calculations. With a bit more of the GPU invested in ray tracing, it should be possible to do some very nice global illumination.
Eso está
Having
muy bien.
said
Pues
A mí me gusta
hacemos
mucho.
una
and ray
demostración
trace
de
shadows and reflections to a
Lo
traditional
haría bien al
graphics
final. A mí
engine
me gusta
could
mucho esto
easily
del ray
take
tracing, la
hundreds
verdad.
of millions
Y
of
teniendo yo una
rays
RTX
and
en
full
el
ray
ordenador,
tracing could
pues...
take billions.
Claro.
How far can we go? I'm starting to get quite bullish. I've already seen a PlayStation 5 title that's successfully using ray tracing-based reflections in complex animated scenes with only modest costs. Another set of issues for the GPU involved size and frequency. How big do we make the GPU, and what frequency do we
Están
want?
hablando ahora del tamaño de la
This is a
CPU, o
balance.
sea, de la
The
GPU,
chip
de
has
la
a
gráfica.
cost, and there's a cost for whatever we use to
Vale,
supply
vale.
that chip with power and to cool it.
Claro, porque cuanto más grandes sean los internos, más grande tiene que ser luego también lo externo,
Let me show you why.
para que quepa todo.
Here's two possible configurations for a GPU roughly of the level of the PlayStation 4 Pro. This is a thought experiment. Don't take these configurations too seriously.
Ah, vale.
If you just
Son
calculate
hipotéticas.
teraflops, you get the
Sí,
same number.
lo he dicho.
But actually, the performance is
como
noticeably
se
different
dice,
because
así es.
teraflops is defined as the computational capability of the vector.
Eso es la
That's
velocidad.
just one part of the GPU. There are a lot of other units. And those other units all run faster when the GPU frequency is higher. At 33% higher frequency, rasterization goes 33% faster. Processing the command buffer goes that much faster. The L2 and other caches have that much higher bandwidth, and so on. About the only downside is that system memory is 33% further away in terms of cycles. But the large number of benefits more than counterbalance that. As a friend of mine says, a rising tide lifts all boats. Also, it's easier to fully use 36 CUs in parallel than it is to fully use 48 CUs. When triangles are small, it's much harder to fill all those CUs with useful work. So there's a lot to be said for faster, assuming you can handle the resulting power and heat issues, which frankly, we haven't always done the best job at. Part of the reason for that is, historically, our process for setting CPU and GPU frequencies has relied on some heavy-duty guesswork with regards to how much electrical power games will consume and how much heat will be produced as a result inside of the console. Power consumption varies a lot from game to game. When I play God of War on my PS4 Pro,
Electricidad,
I know
¿no?
the power consumption is high just by the
¿Eh?
fan noise.
¿Qué?
But power
Eso
isn't
de la
simply
electricidad
about
que
engine
gasta.
quality.
No,
It's about the
bueno, el
minutia of what's
consumo
being
y el
displayed
calor.
and how. It's
Y
Ah, el
los
calor.
recursos
but
que gasta y tal.
processing dense geometry
Madre
typically
mía, anda,
consumes
anda
less
que no
power
sirve
than
esto para la
processing
Play
simple
4, ¿eh?
geometry, which is,
Anda que no se
I
calienta la
suspect,
Play.
why Horizon's
Madre
map
mía,
screen,
esto
with
fría.
its low triangle count, makes my
Creo que pones,
PS4 Pro
hace así,
heat
pum,
up
con
so
un
much.
huevo lo abre y se fríe.
Our process on previous consoles has been to try to guess what the maximum power consumption during the entire console lifetime might be, which is to say, the worst case scene in the worst case game, and prepare a cooling solution that we think will be quiet at that power level.
Vale, están
If we
hablando de
get it
una
right,
refrigeración
fan noise
nueva.
is minimal. If we get it wrong, the
Hostia,
console will be
normal.
quite loud for the higher power games, and there's even a chance that it might overheat and shut down if we misestimate power too badly.
Vale.
PlayStation 5
O sea que dicen que como no tengan cuidado se apaga la Play porque se sobrecalienta. Que es lo que le pasa, es lo que le pasa a la 4A4.
These are great here and
Ah,
there,
bueno, sí,
but
sí.
presumably only minimally used. Or are they? If we plan for major 256-bit instruction usage, we need to set the CPU clock substantially lower or noticeably increase the size of the power supply and fan. So, after much discussion, we decided to go with a very different direction on PlayStation 5. We built a GPU with 36 CUs. Mind you, RDNA2 CUs are large. Each has 62% more transistors than the CUs we were using on PlayStation 4. So if we compare transistor counts, 36 RDNA2 CUs equates to roughly 58 PlayStation 4 CUs. It is a fairly sizable GPU. Then we went with a variable frequency strategy for PlayStation 5, which is to say we continuously run the GPU and CPU in boost mode. We supply a generous amount of electrical power and then increase the frequency.
O sea que dicen que consumirá más, pero que podremos tener a la vez en la CPU y en la GPU el modo boost. Para que vaya más rápido, pero se calentará más, obviamente.
O sea, podemos sobrecopiar la consola.
Podremos, sí. Podríamos hacer un overclock, por decirlo de alguna manera.
Sí, tendrá un modo
We
overclock
then
oficial.
tackled the engineering challenge of a cost-effective and high-performance cooling solution designed for that specific power level. In some ways, it becomes a simpler problem because there are no more unknowns. There's no need to guess what power consumption the worst-case game might have. As for the details of the cooling solution, we're saving them for our teardown. I think you'll be quite happy with what the engineering
Llevamos ya
team
40
came up
minutos.
with. So, how fast can we run the GPU and CPU with this
Yo
strategy?
lo el
The
sistema.
simplest approach would be to look at the actual temperature of the silicon die and throttle the frequency on that basis. But that won't work. It fails to create a consistent PlayStation 5 experience. It wouldn't do to run a console slower simply because it was in a hot room. So rather than look at the actual temperature of the silicon die, we look at the activities that the GPU and CPU are performing and set the frequencies on that basis, which makes everything deterministic and repeatable. While we're at it, we also use AMD's Smart Shift technology and send any unused power from the CPU to the GPU so it can squeeze out a few more pixels. The benefits of this strategy are quite large. Running a GPU at 2 gigahertz was looking like an unreachable target with the old fixed frequency strategy. With this new paradigm, we're able to run way over that. In fact, we have to cap the GPU frequency at 2.23 gigahertz so that we can guarantee that the on-chip logic operates properly.
Dice que algo estaba capado, pero no sé si explico.
36 CUs at 2.23
No, eso no lo escuchaba,
gigahertz
estaba viendo.
Hostia,
3 teraflops. And we expect
Madre mía, han multiplicado por 2, ¿eh?
at or close to
Sí.
that frequency and performance. Similarly, running the CPU at 3 gigahertz was causing headaches with the old strategy. But now we can run it as high as 3.5 gigahertz. In fact, it spends most of its time at that frequency. That doesn't mean all games
Supongo que
will
los
run
3,5 será la
2.23
frecuencia ya con el
gigahertz or
overclock,
3.5
¿no?
gigahertz. When that worst case game
Digo yo,
arrives, it will run at a lower clock speed, but not too much.
Con el
lower.
modo boost.
To reduce power by 10%, it only takes a couple of percent reduction in frequency, so I'd expect any downclocking to be pretty minor. All things considered, the change to a variable frequency approach will show significant gains for PlayStation gamers. The final of our 3 principles was about finding
Vale.
new
Finding
dreams.
new
Venga,
It's
va.
dreams.
important for us on the hardware team to find
Ah, ¿así
new
está el
ways to
diseño aquí o
expand
después?
or deepen gaming, and that's what led us to a focus on 3D audio. As players, we experience the game through the visuals, through audio, and through the feedback we receive from the controller, such as rumble or haptics. Personally, I feel a game is just dead without audio. Visuals are, of course, important, but the
Exactamente.
impact
Es
of audio
verdad.
is
Un
huge.
juego
as
sin
well.
Es que un
audio.
juego sin...
At the same
Exactamente.
time, the audio team on a game project has to do a lot with a little. For example, on PlayStation 4, there's fierce competition for the Jaguar CPU cores. Audio typically ends up getting just a fraction of a core.
Buah, y a ver si enseñan el
That's
mando,
not
tío.
much of a computational
Es verdad, el
resource,
DualShock 5, a ver
particularly
cuándo
when
lo
you
enseñan.
consider that the visuals run at 30
Pero
or
guapo.
60 frames a
Sí,
second,
lo
but
enseñan.
audio processing needs to happen at almost 200 times a second. So, it's been tough going making forward progress on
Aquí
audio
son
on
capaces esto de
PlayStation
estarse
4,
dos horas
particularly when
hablando,
PlayStation 3 was such a beast when it came to audio.
Sí,
The
el
SPUs
proceso.
Ojo al
themselves
procesador de
were
audio.
almost a perfect device for audio rendering.
Y
Simple
tengo que hacer el
pipelined
sistema de
El
las
render
algorithms
de
tías.
audio.
Estamos
really take
tardando demasiado
advantage of
eso.
asynchronous DMA and frequently reach
Molaría pusieran un
100%
7.1,
utilization
¿sabes?
of the
En plan...
floating point unit.
Estaría
There's
guapo. En plan
unfortunately
audio
nothing
3D.
comparable on PlayStation 4. Probably the most dramatic progress in the PlayStation 4 generation has been with
Ojo, las
virtual
VR.
reality. The
Ojo,
PSVR
¿vas a sacar
hardware has its
VR?
own audio.
No, 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 que están hablando de
It
las VR
supports
de la
about
Play 4.
50 pretty decent
Ah.
3D sound sources. And this
Están
provides
hablando ahora del
a
sonido
hint
3D.
as to where we could go with
Vale,
audio,
vale.
as well as some valuable
Pero esto está diciendo que las VR de la Play 4
Not
serán
to
compatibles con las de la
oversimplify, but
5.
here were our
Ah,
goals
vale.
for
Le
audio
da
on
demasiada
PlayStation
población a
4.
no.
The first goal was great audio
Good
for
for
everyone,
audio.
not just VR users or soundbar owners or headphone users. That meant audio had to be part of the console. It couldn't be a peripheral. The second goal was to support hundreds of sound sources. We didn't want developers to have to pick and choose what sounds would get 3D effects and which wouldn't. We wanted every sound in the game to have dimensionality. And finally, we wanted to really take on the challenges of presence and locality. Now, when we say presence, we mean the feeling that you're actually there.
O sea, la inmersión del juego con el
It's not, of
sonido.
course, something we
Ah.
thought we could perfectly achieve. But the
O sea, la
idea was
presence,
that if we
presence
stopped
lo que ha
using
dicho
just
es
a
la
rain
presencia en
sound
plan de
and instead
parecer
use
que estás ahí,
lots of
¿sabes?
3D audio sources
Sí,
for
mira,
raindrops
mira,
hitting the
esa
ground,
Ahí está,
es-
ahí
all
lo
sorts of
pone el
locations
gráfico.
around you, then at some point your brain would take a leap and you'd begin to have this feeling of real presence inside the virtual world of the game. This has the capacity to affect your appreciation of the game, just like music in a game does.
Exactamente.
The concept of locality is simpler. It's just your sense of where the audio is coming from, to the right of you, behind you, above you. This can immerse you further in the game, and it can also directly enhance the gameplay. To use Dead Space as an example, I know, old school, you're fighting enemies in fairly dark, spooky locations. Back in the day, if you played the game using the TV speakers, you could tell that there was one last enemy growling and hunting you down, but it was difficult to tell quite where that enemy was. With headphones, you could tell that the enemy was somewhere on the right, which let you deduce, if you couldn't see it, that it must be somewhere behind and to your right.
Sí.
But with 3D audio with good locality, the idea is you know the enemy is precisely there, and you turn and you take it out. So, how do we know where a
O sea, justo
sound
dónde
is coming
está.
from in the first
Sí,
place?
lo que están diciendo es
Well,
como una especie de
all
sonido
those bumps
3D
and folds
para
in the
saber
ear
dónde
have a meaning,
están.
evolutionarily speaking.
Bueno, para,
Based on what direction the sound
para
is
una mejor
coming from,
inmersión en un
sound
juego.
waves bounce around inside the ear, there's some constructive and destructive interference, and the result is a change in volume. The phase of the sound also shifts, depending on what path the sound wave took to reach the ear canal. These volume changes and phase shifts are different for each direction and also vary depending on the frequency of the sound. Head size and head shape also impact the sound in a similar fashion. The way that the sound changes, based on direction and
Hostia.
frequency, can be encoded in a table called the Head-Related Transfer Function, or HRTF. Here's part of one. The vertical axis is the frequency. The horizontal axis is the direction, front, back, left, right, and the color gives the degree of attenuation of the sound at that frequency. The HRTF is as unique to an individual as a fingerprint is. In fact, you're looking at mine right now. Here's how we measure an HRTF. We've taken hundreds of people.
¿Qué coño es eso?
We put
Es un
a
dispositivo.
microphone in the subject's left and right ear canal,
Ah, vale, lo entiendo.
and then sit the subject down in the middle of an array
Es
of
como lo hacen,
22
¿no?
speakers.
Son
We then play an
altavoces
audio sweep from each speaker as we rotate the
y
subject. In the course of
entonces
10 or 20 minutes,
es
we're
como,
able to
es como
sample
una
the
prueba para la
HRTF
inmersión
at
este
over
sonido.
1,000 locations.
Es lo que hacen.
Using an HRTF when
Mira, ahí
rendering audio
todo lo
creates
que usa de YouTube es
unparalleled
de...
quality, but it's
Ojo, claro.
computationally expensive. The simplest way to use an HRTF is to process a sound source to make it appear as if it's coming from one of those 1,000 locations we sample. Unfortunately, the processing has to be done in frequency domain rather than time domain, so there's multiple fast Fourier transforms needed for every
Está
sound
bien.
source for every audio tick. That's a lot of multiplies.
Y esto se supone que la Play 4 no lo
Computational complexity was
tiene.
the determining factor for
O
our
sea, esto
strategy.
solo lo tendrá
It
la
meant
Play
we had to
5.
bite the bullet and design and build a custom hardware unit for 3D audio. Collectively, we're referring to the hardware unit and the proprietary algorithms we run on it as Tempest 3D Audio Tech. The meaning of 3D audio and technology should be pretty obvious here. As for Tempest, I feel it really reflects our goals with audio. It suggests a certain intensity of experience and also hints at your presence within it. We're calling the hardware unit that we built the Tempest engine. It's based on AMD's GPU technology. We modified a compute unit in such a way as to make it very close to the SPUs in PlayStation 3. Remember when I said that they were ideal for audio? So the Tempest engine has no caches, just like an SPU. All data access is via DMA,
Que el
just like
audio
an
es un
SPU.
poco así, ¿sabes?
Our target was that it would have more power than a
Está bien,
CPU,
pero
thanks
sí.
to the parallelism that a GPU can achieve, and that it would be more efficient than our GPU thanks to the SPU.
También depende mucho de los
architecture.
altavoces que
The
tengas.
goal being to make possible near 100% utilization
De los
of the
cascos.
CU's
O los
vector
cascos,
units.
claro.
Where
Por
we
mucha
ended up
tecnología que
is a
tenga la
unit
Play
with roughly
5,
the
si
same
tú tienes unos
single
cascos de
power and
mierda del
bandwidth
colacao
as
como
all
yo, pues
8
no te va a
Jaguar
llegar.
cores in the PlayStation 4 combined.
Los verdes esos que
If we
tengo.
were to use the same
proyectan.
algorithms as PSVR, that's enough for something like 5,000 sound sources. But of course, we want to use more
Cómpratelo
complex
Gold, Noel.
algorithms, and we don't need anything like that number of
Cómpratelo Gold.
sounds.
No, los Gold no, me
It would
compraré
have
los
been
Razer Kraken.
wonderful if a simpler strategy, such as using Dolby
¿Quieres
Atmos
traído
peripherals,
Ferrari?
could have achieved our goals, but we wanted 3D
Vale,
audio for
córtale
all,
ya el diseño.
not just those with licensed soundbars or the like.
Ay.
Also, we wanted many hundreds of sound sources, not just the 32 that Atmos supports. And finally, we wanted to be able to throw an overwhelming amount of processing power at the problem, and it wasn't clear what any peripheral might have inside of it. In fact, with the Tempest engine, we've even got enough power that we
Pues
can
algo ahí,
allocate some
pero
to the
no,
games,
no te
to the
puedo
extent that games want to make use of convolution reverb and other algorithms that are either computationally expensive or need high bandwidth. But the primary purpose of the Tempest engine remains 3D audio. Now, 3D audio is a major academic research
pesa con
topic.
el audio,
It's safe
tío.
to say that no one in the world has all
Poco-
A
the
ver,
answers.
es que
And
este
the
es
set of
ingeniero
algorithms
de
that have to be
hardware.
invented, tuned,
Con lo
or
cual
implemented to
no va a
realize our vision
hacer,
for 3D
no va a decir
audio
nada del
is
diseño final de la
immense.
Play. Eso a lo
For
mejor será el
example,
diseñador.
use of
O
HRTFs
sea
in
que
games is quite
mientras esté este
complex.
tío en la pantalla vamos
Before,
a
I
estar
talked
hablando de
about making a
hardware.
sound source appear as if it's coming from one of those 1,000 HRTF sample
Ay, ¿qué hora es?
locations. But for high quality
Ah.
Tienes 50 ya,
audio,
tío.
we have to handle other
O
possibilities.
sea, ya llevamos
Pues-
52
The sound
minutos de
source might
directo.
not be
Llevamos.
at one of the 1,000 HRTF
Ah,
sample
entiendo.
locations, so we have to blend
Bueno, lo del audio lo va a
HRTF
ver
data from the
mi abuela.
closest locations that we have sampled.
Mira, Julio se ha
The sound
conectado
source might be
al...
moving, which needs
al Modern
very
Warfare.
special handling as that blend keeps changing, and that can cause phase artifacts in the resulting audio. Or the sound source might have a size to it, meaning it should feel as if it's coming from an area rather than a single point. There's also whole categories of approaches to be handled. 3D audio can be implemented using individual processing of 3D sound sources. But alternatively, ambisonics can be used for 3D audio. Ambisonics being somewhat like the
Ambisonics,
spherical
¿qué
harmonics used in computer graphics.
Creo
And
que
finally,
esto
there's audio
es
devices.
los grados
The player
de,
might
en
be
plan,
using headphones
de
or
dónde viene
TV
el sonido.
speakers or have a
Mira,
higher-end
headphones
surround
from
sound
TV
setup with 6
speakers.
or more speakers,
ver.
all of which need different approaches. That's a lot of variations. It's nice to have the
Los cascos que
computational
está hablando creo que
resources
son
of
los
the
míos.
Tempest
No
engine.
me
Son los
parece-
Gold,
It's
los
clear
cascos
that
que han puesto
achieving
son
our
los Gold,
ultimate
sí.
goals with 3D
Hombre,
audio
son
is
los
going to be
suyos,
a
normal.
multi-year, step-by-step process. Having said
Mira,
that,
ahí están.
headphone audio implementation
A ver
is
si me da
largely
un
complete at this time.
consejo.
It was a natural place for us to start. With headphones, we control exactly what each ear hears, and therefore the algorithmic development and implementation are more straightforward. For TV speakers and stereo speakers, we're in the process of implementing virtual surround sound. The The idea being that if you're sitting in a sweet spot in front of the TV, then the sound can be made to feel as if it's coming from any direction, even behind you. Virtual surround sound has a lot in common with 3D audio on headphones, but it's more complex because the left ear can hear the right speaker and vice versa. We have a basic implementation of virtual surround sound up and running. We're now looking at increasing the size of that sweet spot, which is to say, making the area you need to be in to feel the 3D effect larger, and we're also working to boost the sense of locality. Headphone audio is the current gold standard for 3D audio on PlayStation 5, but we're going to see what we can do to bring virtual surround sound to a similar level, after which we'll start in on setups with more speakers, such as 6-channel surround sound. It's now to the point where some of the PlayStation 5 games in development are extensively using these systems. One of the game demos allows you to toggle between conventional PlayStation 4 style stereo audio and our new 3D audio. I listened with just an ordinary pair of over-the-ear headphones, and wow, I could feel a difference. 3D audio has that dimensional feel to it.
Wow.
Conventional stereo audio feels
I can feel the
difference.
difference.
The improvement is obvious.
I can feel it, bro.
So, a big advancement, but have I entered the matrix? Does my brain believe I'm really there? Like I was talking about earlier when I explained our target of presence. Well, the answer is no.
Bueno, que la
But
verdad es que me da
you've
igual
probably
el
caught on
sonido.
to what's missing here, namely whose HRTF was being used.
A ver, que
Voy a
es
hacer
una,
un poco de la
a ver,
It was the
es una parte
default
importante, ¿no? De las consolas y
The
el
audio
sonido que
team
tengan y
analyzed
tal.
the hundreds
Porque
of
un juego,
they
como ha
measured,
dicho
chose
antes
the
este
one they
tío,
felt
un juego sin
closest
sonido,
fit
pues la
the total
verdad es que
gameplay
no es un
audience.
juego.
Está muerto.
This shows
Exactamente.
a piece of the default
Sobre todo la
HRTF
música
on
lo
the
que le
left.
da
In my HRTF
así
on
al
the right,
juego.
you can see that the general features are
De la
much the
diversidad
same,
de la vida
but
sin
the
existir la
details
música.
are
O sea,
quite
esto es muy
different.
aburrido.
With the default HRTF, as I said, the 3D audio sounds pretty great. When I use my HRTF, though, the
Bueno, yo
audio
voy
reaches a
instalando la máquina
higher
virtual.
level of realism, which is to say
No sé cuánta
that when
RAM
using
darle.
headphones
¿Cuánto le di a
and
la
my
otra? A
HRTF,
ver.
I occasionally get fooled and even think a sound is coming from the
6,
real
pues le doy
world
6
when it's
también.
actually coming from the game. A corollary to this is that there are a few people whose HRTFs are sufficiently far from the default HRTF, that's the red dot here, that they can toggle between PS4 style and PS5 style audio and not sense much
PS4.
difference. I've had a few people describe the PlayStation 5's 3D audio as sounding like a bit better stereo audio. Presumably they're the ones at the very edges of this diagram. Which means what HRTF you're using is key. I'd like everyone to be able to experience what I'm experiencing, but obviously it's not possible to measure the HRTF of every PlayStation user. That means HRTF selection and synthesis are going to be big topics going forward as the Tempest technology matures. At PlayStation 5 launch, we'll be offering a choice of 5 HRTFs. There's a simple test where you pick the one that gives you the best locality. That's just the first step, though. This is an open-ended research topic. Maybe you'll be sending us a photo of your ear, and we'll choose a neural network to pick the closest HRTF in our library. Maybe you'll be sending us a video of your ears and your head, and we'll make a 3D model of them and synthesize the HRTF. Maybe you'll play an audio game to tune your HRTF. We'll be subtly changing it as you play and home in on the HRTF.
Están hablando de
that gives you
audio
the
3D
highest score,
customizado para
meaning
las
that it
personas,
matches you the best.
¿Qué dice?
This is a journey we're
Audio
all taking
3D
together over the
customizado para
next few
cada
years.
persona y
Ultimately, we're
usuario.
committing to enabling
Bueno,
everyone
que
to
todavía no saben cómo
experience
hacerlo,
that
pero que
next
tienen varias
level
ideas en
of
mente. Como por
realism.
ejemplo algún juego para configurarlo.
Hopefully,
No
I've
sé,
been
algo
able to
así.
illustrate a bit about our design and decision-making process today and why PlayStation 5 has the feature set that it does. Now comes the fun part. We get to see how the development community takes advantage of that feature set. I'm hoping for the completely unexpected. Will it come from audio, ray tracing, the capabilities of the SSD, or something else? I guess we'll find out soon enough.
Ojo.
Thank you for your time today.
¿Ya se ha acabado?
No, espérate, que ahora después de esto pondrán algo más. De verdad.
¿Seguro?
Por poner algo más. A veces lo hacen, al menos en Nintendo lo hacen.
Pues me da que ya se ha acabado, ¿eh? Bueno, llevan ya
segundillos.
llevan
Vale,
ya
no,
una...
se ha acabado.
¿Se ha acabado?
Se ha acabado. O sea, a mí se me ha saltado ya. ¿Qué ha dicho al final? No me he enterado.
Pues básicamente ha dicho gracias. Ya está, solo ha dicho eso.
Pon una F, yo voy a poner F, tío. O sea, está bien, pero no sé, un poco raro, ¿no?
O sea, no han dicho nada, o sea, lo único que han dicho ha sido detalles de hardware y ya está. Nada de los mandos, nada de la tecnología que
Ya,
puedan tener
tío.
los mandos.
Le
No
falta
han dicho
peso.
nada de la estructura física que va a tener o sea, la estructura, de esto que va a tener. Bueno, no sé yo. A ver, si me deja salir
Está
de aquí
bien.
porque se me ha bugueado esto de una manera increíble. O sea, no me va el YouTube ahora. Pero bueno, chicos,
Voy a
pues
ver para
nada.
un poquillo más de algo, de lo que más se ve, ¿sabes?
Sí, yo de hecho también, ¿eh?
Lo
Yo
del
creo,
mando, aunque
lo voy
sea,
a
te
poner
digo que es
aquí.
algo muy básico.
Yo creo, la verdad, que lo podían haber hecho mejor.
Joder.
Pero bueno.
Mm.
Bueno, chicos, pues hasta aquí vamos a acabar el directo. Pensábamos que iba a ser otra cosa, pero bueno, han dado detalles importantes, bastante importantes de la Play 4, de la Play 5, perdón. Han hecho una comparativa entre algunas cosas de Play 5 y otras de Play 4. Y nada, bueno, pues espero que os haya gustado el directo. Y nada, cuando hagan el anuncio oficial, o sea, o sea, a ver, esto, uy, coño, que me cargo el micro. Este era oficial. Hostia, el gapo que le soltaba la pantalla.
¿Cómo?
Le he soltado un gapo a la
¿Cómo está?
pantalla. Bueno,
Descarga que
lo
se
dicho, que
cargue.
cuando hagan el anuncio oficial ya con el diseño de la Play 5 y tal, haremos otro directo. Así que nada, chicos, espero que os haya gustado este y nos vemos en el siguiente. Adiós. Adiós.
Avísame cuando lo hayas cortado.